and welcome to episode 3 of Mind the Brain. I'm Nikita Nambiar, and I sat with Dr.Anil Neelakantan, who is an attending physician and adult neurologist at Gould Medical Group. He's also the member of the board of directors of Gould Medical Group, where he is one among 9 director board members, and he sets policies, governs, manages, and directs the practices of more than 375 physicians in various Gould Medical Group locations in Northern California. He's also the chair of medical specialties at Gould Medical Group, and he's an attending physician as well for the adult neurologist for inpatient services at St. Joseph's Medical Center for Stockton, California. His research is varied and expansive, and he has conducted research, for example, in the effects of hypovitaminosis D on EMG and nerve conduction studies in patients with established diabetic neuropathy. He's also evaluated the possible mechanisms involved in the pathogenesis of auditory neuropathy at the State University of New York at Buffalo, and that's just one among the many research projects that he's taken part in. So, without detracting any further, let's move on to the video. Welcome everyone to episode 3 of Mind the Brain. I'm seated today with Dr. Anil Neelakantan. So let's start off the session with a bang. Dr. Neelakantan, could you share with us, could you share with our audience how you found that neurology is the field for you? What about it intrigues you and what fascinates you really?
So the way I got to neurology is kind of a long road. It was kind of a circuitous road, if you will. So during my 11th and 12th, my real like hardcore passion was physics and biophysics. So I was really fond of physics. So as I got into med school, naturally I inclined towards physiology because that had a lot of electricity, had a lot of channel kinetics, physics, and there's only 2 real systems that rely on electrical activities: heart and the brain. And after I did my med school, I did research for 5 years, and it happened to be in a neuroscience lab. And so I got interested in neuroscience more than cardiology at that point. And so transition to neurology was kind of natural. So that's how I ended up in neurology. And also, back in med school, I was always interested in neural networks, a little artificial intelligence, although it was not as advanced now as it is now back then. So, so it was kind of a natural transition.
That's really great to hear. I know there are a lot of kids who are like in the physics field who think that there's no connection whatsoever with the neurosciences, but there is, and it's really great that you.
Oh my God. Absolutely. So just to give you some idea as to how deep it can go. So for 5 years, I was working on what's called ion channel kinetics, which basically is the way in which ion channels in these cells move when a certain ligand or an activating molecule binds to it and it activates. It lets ions come in, which then gives electrical signaling to the cells. So I was looking at the kinetics of the channel, which basically means how the channel moves, which is a lot of statistics, a lot of computer modeling, and you have to really know the electrical properties of the cell, a ton of calculus, if you will. So for those who take bio, if you don't think you need math, think again.
Great. I'm sure, yeah, that's a lot of really great insight. So now I'd like to kind of zoom into the present day. So a lot of researchers are actually now finding that COVID could have possible impacts on the brain, causing like a swelling of the brain. So I wanted to understand your thoughts on, let's say the swelling of the brain, how it influences the rest of our body and what it really does, if there's a larger implication from COVID-19, which, what your thoughts on it are.
So yes, it causes multi-system inflammation. So, so typically COVID or coronavirus is a respiratory virus. It's a common cold virus, but this particular virus has a mutation that made it much more deadly, if you will, and much more active Now, the problem is not the virus per se, but the inflammatory reaction that your body creates to the virus. So sometimes when the virus gets in, your body goes gung-ho about it and starts attacking the virus, but the response is tremendous. When the response is tremendous, it can start to affect more than just the organ it infects. So it can result in increased risk of cardiac problems. It can cause cardiomyopathy, which is a disease of the heart cells, heart muscle cells. It can cause, in children, Kawasaki syndrome, which is basically where you have the coronary arteries that are affected. It can cause aneurysm of the coronary artery. It can cause the heart to not pump correctly. Sometimes it can drop down to less than 10% of pumping of the heart, which can cause heart failure in kids. It can also cause like high fever, rashes all over the body, tongue changes, lymph nodes. The neurological complications are seen a little bit more in adults than they are seen in kids. In adults, you can see encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain, meningitis, inflammation of the coverings of the brain. It can cause blood clots in the brain, which can cause strokes, and that can occur in two different ways. It can occur because of inflammation of the blood vessels themselves, which makes it narrow. It can also increase the risk of development of blood clots due to something called D-dimer, which can then result in clot formation within the brain. So there's inflammation of the vessels and there is clot formation on top of that. And in addition to this, also the irregular heartbeat that occurs because of the cardiac problem can cause stagnation of blood inside the heart, which can result in blood clots being formed in the heart, which can then go into the brain and cause a stroke. Atrial fibrillation is what it's called. It can cause nerve damage in your hands and feet. It can cause a syndrome called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which can paralyze people from head to toe for a few weeks. And sometimes they would need ventilators because their breathing muscles might be too weak. It can cause something called ADEM, which is an inflammatory reaction occurring in the wiring of the brain, which is the white matter of the brain. It can also occur in the spinal cord, and if it occurs only in the spinal cord, it's called transverse myelitis. So it can affect the brain, it can affect the spinal cord, it can affect the nerves, the nerve roots. Pretty much all parts of the nervous system can get affected. Also, some people develop seizures as well. So it's a multi-system disease, actually.
And it's scary to think that a lot of us, because we're not so exposed to information about COVID, we think it's restricted just to like the respiratory system, but it's so much more than just that.
It's absolutely more than a respiratory system, yeah. So in respiratory system is the primary source through which it enters your body. But if you think about it, the first thing that it hits in your nose is actually the nerves that control the sense of smell. So in many cases of COVID, a week or so before they develop the respiratory symptoms, they might actually lose their sense of smell. They don't exactly know why that occurs, but they think that it is because of the infection or inflammation of the olfactory nerves, which is the nerves that control the sense of smell in your nose. So, and then from there, it's a direct entry into the brain.
And that's definitely really scary. But it's good that there's a lot of research being done too. And that brings me to the next question. So in a kind of similar way, neurodegenerative diseases now have a lot of research being done on them. And it's a field that definitely has piqued my interest. Having a lot of friends and family have neurodegenerative diseases, I've always kind of wanted to know more about it. So like for diseases like MS or ADL, yeah, there is a lot of research being done, but I wanted to know to what extent does the amount of research that we're doing, how does that paint a better future for the patients that have these diseases? Are we looking at possibly being able to cure them?
Right. So most of these neurodegenerative diseases are very complex diseases. So it's not, and typically by the time we see the symptoms, it's kind of at the stage where the brain cannot compensate anymore. So oftentimes the trials for medications are falling flat on their face, if you will, because you're hitting it too late. So what they're trying to do now is they're trying to identify when do these diseases actually start. For example, if you look at Alzheimer's disease, typically it's traditionally thought that Alzheimer's disease is caused because of the accumulation of an abnormal protein in the brain known as amyloid protein, which then causes cell degeneration and cell death, and then eventually it causes memory loss when you have destroyed enough number of cells. Now, the problem with that is you don't show symptoms usually until you're 65 to 70 years old. But if you look at people at the ages of 50, 55, and you do amyloid scans on them, you'll see that a bunch of them have actually amyloid at that age. So amyloid accumulation in the brain is starting in the 50s, but many of them don't show symptoms until they're in their 60s. Now, by the time you show symptoms, you have lost enough neurons, so it's kind of too late to hit it at that point. So the research is now being done to figure out, can you identify the subset of population, those who have amyloid, who are actually going to develop things like Alzheimer's, for example? And can you target the problem ahead of time? Can you identify the genes that are responsible for this? Is there an environmental factor that is responsible for this? There's a whole bunch of research that's being done just in the Alzheimer's front. That's multi-billion-dollar research is being done in that. Similarly, Parkinson's disease, ALS, these are all pretty much devastating diseases that can really put you in a wheelchair and oftentimes are fatal. Things like ALS is usually fatal within a few years. So a lot of research is being done right now to try to identify when does this start, how can we target it early on, are there lifestyle modifications or medications or other things that can be done early on before it gets to the stage where it becomes symptomatic. So that's kind of where it's headed. And with the new AI technology, they're trying to identify targets. So the problem with the genetic analysis is that there's a ton of red herring sometimes. You might see some mutations that may not be relevant. You might have a ton of noise in the data, if you will. But if you can do big data crunching and you can identify patterns which may not be obvious to the human eye, but an algorithm and a neural networks algorithm can pick it up just like that, you might be able to identify targets ahead. So I wouldn't be surprised going forward if we started employing more and more of ML and AI to identify drug targets and identifying mechanisms of disease. So in the next 15 to 20 years, we might achieve much more than what was done in the past 100 years.
And that brings me to the next question, actually. So I like to think of the neurosciences as being really plastic. It's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing. There's new research done practically every day. So with this in mind, is there any new development that's really piqued your interest, something that stood out and you'd like to share with all of us?
So one of the things that recently I saw was there's this device. It's called the RNS device. So it's kind of like a little chip that you can put in the brain. Now, it doesn't enhance your memory or anything. It's got nothing to do with that. It's actually, its purpose is to identify electrical abnormalities in the brain early on. So let me back up a little bit. Seizures. Seizures are basically abnormal electrical activity that occurs in the brain. It might be localized to one part of the brain, like the frontal lobe or temporal lobe or occipital lobe. Sometimes it might start in one part and then spread all over like a wildfire. It happens, you get what's called a focal to generalized tonic-clonic seizure. So what this RNS does is it sits in one part of the brain, constantly monitors for abnormal seizure activity that is starting, and it zaps it. It basically zaps it in the bud, and it nips it in the bud. So you really don't progress, if you will, to a full-blown seizure. Sometimes it might stay as a focal seizure. So it's kind of like a defibrillator, if you will, for seizures. So that is a cool piece of device. I've seen that implanted in several patients now. and they've had pretty good success rate in reducing the number of seizures.
That's really cool. I've read about RNS implant devices as well. I also watched this docu-series on Netflix. So the audience, you guys can try finding it out. I don't remember the name, but they used the RNS implantation for a young girl who was like constantly having seizures. They couldn't detect why she was having seizures, but they put it in, and the results were like incredible. She was taking like steroids before that to try to calm her seizures, but that wasn't working. So once they put in the implant, she got so much better. So this is definitely really cool technology, and it just shows.
And this is a prime.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, this is a prime example. No, this is a prime example of technology interfacing with medicine. So that's development of such a device basically requires high-tech VLSI lab. It requires electronics engineers. You need to have material scientists, because you really don't want to put something that can trigger a bad reaction in the body. So you don't want to put something that trigger either something that is prone to developing allergies, something that is prone to deteriorating in the brain, or any part of the body for that matter, or put anything that is toxic. For example, you don't want to make something out of lead and put it in the body because you get toxicity from it. So there's a whole bunch of different aspects to it than developing a computer that is sitting on your desk. So there's so much different domains that interface into a device like this.
And I think that's also true for like the cognitive sciences as a whole. It's an amalgamation of a bunch of different fields. And we tend to think of it as being like psychology or neuroscience, but there's so much more to it. Linguistics and just behavioral analysis, everything comes under the cognitive sciences, which you don't really think about. So kind of as a concluding thought, kind of detracting from the conversation we had so far, I would love if you could share with our audience what has been like the most memorable experience that you've had working in neurology, and maybe like the hardest part of the process, and share with us some advice so that we can continue in this field and strive in a field of neurosciences and the cognitive sciences.
So there's this. Are you looking for a story, something about a patient that that I can share?
Yeah, that would be great.
With you?
Yep.
Okay. So I saw this lady. This was about 3 or 4 years ago. She came to me because she was having a little bit of difficulty taking her grocery home, not able to hold the bags too well. So she was feeling a little bit weak. And every time she tried to lift something, her hands would shake a little bit. So she went to her primary care doctor, who said, I think you really should see a neurologist. And she came to me. And before she ended up with me, she was told that there's a possibility that this could be ALS. Because she was developing progressive weakness, she was having some difficulty swallowing, she was choking on her food, she was losing her balance, so they were really worried that this was ALS. So when I saw her, I said, yeah, this could be ALS, but there's another possibility. There's something called multifocal motor neuropathy, and which can kind of mimic ALS, but it is treatable, while ALS is not. So I said, don't lose hope yet, because we don't exactly know what it is. So let's not jump the gun. And then I did something called an EMG nerve conduction study. So that's where we hook you up to a device, an amplifier that records the activity from the nerves and the muscles. And you can do some analysis on it. You can figure out if the nerve conduction velocities are normal, if the muscles are working correctly, etc. And from that, it was pretty obvious that she actually had multifocal motor neuropathy. And she basically came in with a fatal diagnosis, but left with a diagnosis that is completely treatable. And she every year she sends me a a card, and oftentimes that card is written by their 4-year-old or 5-year-old daughter, that says, "Thank you for fixing my mom." So I always save those cards because those are the kind of precious things that I keep, because that tells me when you have long hours, when you have when you've had a stressful day, or when you there are days when you basically kind of hit the wall, if you will. And at that time, these are the kind of things that keep you going. You know why you're doing it. You're not really doing this for fixing some minor thing, but you're actually changing people's lives. So you're actually touching so many people's lives. And that is the single most important thing that keeps me going through the day, because that is the primary driver. If you don't have that urge to, that realization that actually, because things tend to become mechanical after some time, right? So when you do a job, it becomes mechanical after some time. But sometimes it takes, things like this, when they happen, it reminds you that you're doing this for a much bigger reason. And oftentimes, it's that vibe that helps you get any tough exam that you have to go through, or any oftentimes physicians have to take recertification, board certification exams, and that sort of stuff. You have the studies never end, right? For a doctor, you got to keep working, you got to keep studying, because things change all the time. So it's that realization that there's a reason why you're doing this, that helps you keep driving forward. So that's a story that I always tell people who want to go into medicine, that hey, this is the reason why you're doing it. Not for the fame, not for the money, not for the social status. It's actually for that you're making a difference.
And I think that's what's most important, and what a lot of our major audience should be considering, because when we're moving into deciding our careers and college majors, that's what we should keep in mind, to make sure that we're really interested, not just for that
money. Absolutely. Because if you're talking about nice car or big house or social status, yeah, but those things get old pretty quickly. So and then the only thing that'll keep you going is actually your interest. So if you're in a field that gives you a ton of money, but you actually hate it, it won't last long. So you need to be passionate about what you're doing. You need to find that passion, find that fire inside you, the thing that keeps you going. When the going gets tough, it's that passion that will actually help you move forward.
Yeah, that's so true. And thank you so much for speaking with us today, Dr. Neelakantan. It was a pleasure having you on and gaining insight into the, so to say, world of the cognitive sciences. So yes, thank you.
No problem at all. No problem at all.